Hello, my name is Akim Halimov. I'm from Kyiv, Ukraine. I'm a journalist by education and I once did journalism. But now I run 1+1 production originals and produce different content, movies, TV series, show, content for YouTube. A separate area of my activity has been documentaries about history for 8 years. Why did I start doing this? Because I'm really annoyed by the injustice. And there is a lot of it if you look at the history of Ukraine and Russia. I myself come from a family of Crimean Tatars. This is a small nation, 200,000 people living in the Crimea. You may have heard, but in 1944, Soviet dictator Stalin blamed the entire nation in treason. He said that the Crimean Tatars helped the Nazi, and in one May night, all the people were deported to Uzbekistan in freight cars. My grandfather was in one of these cars. His name was also Akim, and he was only 12 years old. 40 years later, the Soviet government ruled that this was wrong and unfair. The charge of treason were unfounded, but no one was punished. The Crimean Tatars were allowed to return, but entire generation of people were destroyed. To this day, Russia continues to promote Soviet narrative about the Crimean Tatars in the Crimea, because the Crimean Tatars don't want to submit to the occupation of the Crimea Peninsula. So, a fictional story has ruined the lives of 200,000 people, including my family. We returned to Crimea, to other motherland, only at 1994. My parents had to begin everything from the 0 point, but they did it. The bodybuilding and everything were okay until 2014. Russia came again and occupied Crimea. They justify this by the history, but it was false. My parents had to move to Kyiv region, to Irpin, and again they had to start everything from the beginning in '65. They took small kiosk and opened cafe. By 24th of February, Russia came again to Kyiv region, exactly to my parents' cafes as well. Thanks God they managed to save, but they had to run again, because now Russia says that not only Crimea, but whole Ukraine belongs to Russia by the history. So that's why I'm exploring history, because this is very important, not only for historians, but for ordinary people as my parents. Let's have a look at the cases when Russia uses history as a weapon. This is the coat of arms of the Russian Empire. It's important for any empire to control and keep its territories under surveillance, and most importantly, the nations who live there. And history is becoming the main weapon of autocratic regimes that want to rule. At least Russia has achieved mastery in using this tool. Over the past 300 years, Ukraine has experienced this fully. But let's back to the coat of arms. This is a very clear example of how historical manipulations work. In general, this coat of arms adorns the frame of an ancient icon. I saw it at the National Museum of History of Ukraine. A few years ago, the museum staff took this frame for restoration, began to clean it, and suddenly the coat of arms of the Russian Empire fell off. And another coat of arms was under it, that of Ivan Mazepa. Who was Ivan Mazepa? He was the Ukrainian hetman who ruled Cossack Ukraine for 22 years. It was the end of the 17th century. During this time, Ukraine became a strong state with its own authorities and a powerful economy. Mazepa was a patron of the arts. He gave many gifts to the church, including this icon. That's why its coat of arms is there. During the Northern War with Sweden, the Russian Tsar refused to help Mazepa defend Ukraine, and the hetman formed an alliance with Karl XII. Of course, after this, Mazepa became a traitor for 300 years. Russian Church, to this day, this is not a joke, reads him anathema, that is, curses him. All the portraits of Mazepa were destroyed, all his coats of arms were erased. This policy worked so hard that even the Ukrainians themselves believed that their national hero was a traitor. The fact that the history is a real weapon for Russia proves that it's controlled by the special services. There is such a powerful historical organization in Russia called the Russian Historical Society. It unites all historical institutions, organizations and scientists and forms the historical policy of the entire state. Here is its chairman. Do you know him? Here he is with Putin. This is the director of the Foreign Intelligence Service. Yes, Russia is probably the only country in the world where the head of the organization that forms the historical policy of the country and the head of all spies is one person. It looks strange, doesn't it? But let's get deeper. In the middle of the last century, Once I managed to get into the KGB archive in Kiev. Now the documents there are declassified and they reveal a lot of interesting things. For example, there was a whole secret commission of historians who wrote history textbook for Ukrainians. This commission was controlled by the KGB. Once this commission was even visited by Lazar Kaganovich, Stalin's right-hand man, who personally controlled that this secret commission would write about another Kazakh hetman, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who is considered one of the founders of Ukraine in the modern sense. In short, the task has always been the same, to make Ukrainian heroes traitors. Instead of that, to show that Ukrainians have always sought to be together with Russia. Destroy or hide in archives all the facts of the fierce resistance of Ukrainians and hide the history of the struggle of Ukrainians for their independence. But show the whole world that we are one people. For what? In order to secure control over our land. It's very simple. So, when you hear from Russian politicians on TV that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, look at these figures. 5.4 million people, population in Norway. 10 million Ukrainians were killed by the Kremlin from 1918 to 1991. The figure is not final. This is the Holodomor, repression, Gulag, other crimes. I'll tell you a story. In 1654, the Ukrainian hetman signed a treaty with the Moscow Tsar. This was typical for those times, when the Ukrainian Cossacks, not having a full statehood, signed treaties with many rules around them. It was an ordinary military alliance which, however, fell apart after a couple of years. It's important that at that time, Muscovites and Ukrainians were completely different people. They have different language, a completely different political tradition, and a different culture. During the Soviet times, the Kremlin felt that Ukraine was trying its best to break away from Moscow, and they used the myth of one nation. History continues to be Russia's weapon. Do you remember the historical essay that Putin launched on the eve of a full-scale invasion? The key idea is that Ukraine as a state never existed, that it emerged in 1991 after the collapse of the USSR. But let's look at this manuscript. This is the Kiev Chronicle of 1187, 12th century. Here we are talking about the death of the Kiev prince, and it is written, and the whole Ukraine wept for him. 12th century, the first mention of the name Ukraine. It was the self-name of our lands. Abroad we were known as Rus, but the peoples themselves called this land Kraina, from the word krayati, kat, that is literally my piece of land. Prince Volodymyr baptized Kiev, the main city of Rus, in 988, 10th century. Moscow was founded in 1147, 12th century. Their country was called Moscovia, and only Peter I came up with the idea of calling it Russia, obviously claiming the heritage of Rus. And Putin follows his tradition. Look what a huge monument Putin put up near the Kremlin to Volodymyr, Prince of Kiev. There is only one question. Has Volodymyr ever been to Moscow? Of course not, because Moscow didn't exist then. There are many such examples, and I will tell you honestly, it's difficult for us to fight propaganda. Here are some numbers. 9 million euros were allocated by the EU to counter propaganda from 2018 to 2020. 300 million euros were allocated by Russia for Russia Today in 2022. So we have to make conclusions and systematically do efforts to resist this Russia's informational weapon.
Russia is waging a political war or an information war, not only against Ukraine, but also against the West, against the global South, and also it is waging an information war on its own population. And we can distinguish between these four major audiences. Ukraine is one of them. And usually we are talking here about various sets of narratives that I also distinguish between strategic narratives and tactical narratives. Strategic narratives or strategic culture is a set of narratives that reflect the genuine understanding or an interpretation, genuine interpretation by the Russian elites of the Russian-Ukrainian war. These are their true beliefs This is not disinformation. This is not lies that they produce with tactical narratives sometimes, but these are real their own beliefs. And there are several strategic narratives that Russia is trying to put onto its own population, but also the world. And one of the major narratives here, strategic narratives, is that Russia is a separate civilization. Russia is not part of Europe. Russia is not part of the West. It's not part of Asia. It's a civilization on its own terms. And this is from this you can have many other strategic narratives. Some of them relate also to Ukraine. Russia uses social networks, but also in the internet in general, in order to promote its own narratives, strategic and also tactical narratives. If we're talking about Ukraine as the major audience, I would here distinguish also between two different Ukrainian audiences. One audience is the Ukrainians who are living currently under occupation, under Russian occupation, on those, as we call it, temporarily occupied territories. And there also you can see different audiences. For example, the Crimean audience is very much different from the audiences in the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk people republics. To the Crimean audience, the narrative is about, it's actually not very much different from what the Kremlin and its channels are using against its own population, domestic population in Russia. It's basically domestic Russian insights, domestic Russian ideas about the unity of the Russian people. But with the Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic, they, for a very long time, they really pushed the narrative that it is probably a true Ukraine, which is friendly towards Russia. So they did not address to those audiences as their domestic audience. This changed after the formal annexation of those territories last year in autumn 2022. But there is another audience on the occupied territories, which they call new Russian territories. And this is Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, which they claim to have annexed. And there they are actually experimenting, because the narratives that they tried to use, the narratives that were tailored first for Crimean audience and then for the audience of the Donbass, they failed. They don't work. And they're experimenting. And it also shows us how flexible, actually, the Russian propaganda machine is. It may produce some ideas, may produce some propaganda tricks, and then they try to measure, then they try to evaluate whether those ideas actually work. And they do this through public opinion polls, through focus groups. So they try to measure everything that they do. And now they're still experimenting, like what particular ideas would work with the audiences in these more recently occupied territories. But this is one, one can say several audiences, but then there is another major audience, which is Ukraine proper, which is under the legitimate control of the Kiev authorities. And here you have various channels. They are, of course, using or trying to use the, as I said, social networks which are used by Ukrainians. And these are, well, all the major social networks. It's Facebook, it's ex-Twitter, it's Instagram, it's TikTok, and of course it's Telegram. Interestingly, they stopped using VK in order to reach Ukrainians because of the ban, essentially, on VK in Ukraine. Odnoklasniki, they actually never really used them because it's a very fringe social network. But all the 5 major networks, that Ukrainians are themselves using. So they're also exploited by the Russian propaganda machine. Sometimes also websites, but social networks are the most important instrument, because these social networks, there you actually can find Ukrainians, using them. And because any political war tries to change the behavior of the nation that we consider to be an enemy nation, this is the main field of work and influence. Ukrainians who live abroad, they who fled as refugees, or who have been living in the West, or at least abroad, even before the start of the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, they live in the same information space as Ukrainians who live in Ukraine. The fact that they have moved away from Ukraine, it doesn't mean that they have moved in the information terms. Yeah, they're still in this information bubble, which is not very different from the information bubble where Ukrainians living in Ukraine live. So there isn't much difference here. There are several organizations that are involved in the Russian propaganda operations on the professional level. And I'm saying professional level because there are also many minor organizations and also freelancers in Russia who are trying to wage a political war against Ukraine, but also against the West on their own. And also in order to then somehow ask from the Kremlin or from the structures of the Kremlin to reward them for what they're doing. So it's also very widespread, and there are dozens of those minor organizations and people, and I wouldn't go into detail here because really these are just many. These minor groups or individuals, also Telegram channels, they're trying to build their capital by doing this, in order to then have an access to the resources that the Kremlin controls. But at the same time, there are a few organizations that do this professionally. And these are the same organizations that have worked with Russian domestic politicians. Basically, these political technologists, firms, consultancy firms that provide information support during election campaigns or various other campaigns that are happening in Russia. And also the same structures are used by the Kremlin to wage an information war against Ukraine. And there are, I will mention three of them. One is the Social Design Agency, which was founded by a person called Ilya Gambashidze. He is now sanctioned by the EU for his involvement in the political war. And another organization that he founded along with the Social Design Agency is called Struktura. So these two organizations that are most active in spreading pro-Kremlin, anti-Ukrainian propaganda, addressing the Ukrainian audience on the territories controlled by the Kiev authorities, and also some Western audiences, especially in France and Germany, but also in the EU in general. Here also we can add the agency called Dialogue or Dialogue. That's a third organization that is professionally involved in the information war against Ukraine or related to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And it's also sanctioned by the EU. So one of the information operations that became notorious, a Russian influence operation that was devised by Social Design Agency and Struktura, is called Doppelganger operation, and it consisted in producing fake screenshots or fake websites that tried to to mimic some of the established websites, such as BBC, for example, or The Guardian, or German well-established media like Die Welt. They tried to, they built websites that looked like those established media, or at least they would produce screenshots. Then they would spread or distribute those screenshots in the social media, and that looked really reliable in a sense, because people saw that, yeah, well, it's a screenshot from the established news agency that we read, that we trust, and that those screenshots would then be reproduced. And unfortunately, as we know, people are very rarely double check information on the internet. They trust some visual confirmations that this is a trusted source. And this is what they did. It's called a doppelganger. Doppelganger is from Germany. It's like a ghost, like a double of a real person. So this is what they did, and that operation was devised by the by Struktura and social design agency. Currently, the Russian propaganda machine aims at promoting 4 major ideas, or they have established 4 narratives and also 4 objectives, which are the following. It's the demobilization of the Ukrainian population, it's demoralization of the armed forces, it's fragmentation of the elites, and it's discreditation of the martial law. So these are 4 major objectives that they try to reach through different means, different media, so social media, also websites, but mostly social media, and also working with particular, sometimes even Ukrainian influencers, using different instruments, trying to inject particular ideas into the mainstream Ukrainian discussions. And then through the process, which I call narrative laundering, it's like money laundering, which, we're trying, when people try to conceal the source of the money, also the process of concealing the source of the narratives. And if this narrative, which originates from the Russian propaganda machine, becomes a legitimate element of the Ukrainian mainstream discussions, then the narrative laundering is successful. But these four major objectives, these are currently the aims of the propaganda machine, because obviously you cannot have successful, efficient resistance from Ukraine if you don't have united elites, if you don't have mobilized population that supports the army. Of course, the demoralization of the enemy is one of the major objectives in any war. This is what Ukraine is also doing in its own information attacks against the Russian state. And of course, the fragmentation of the elites, and these are major objectives now. Unfortunately, I must say that it is much more problematic when it comes to countering the propaganda messages, countering disinformation. And I must also say that disinformation is not a necessary element of the propaganda machine or the political war. These may be even legitimate facts, legitimate information that is being exploited and weaponized in the political war. But I would here mention probably 2 instruments that I think can be useful in countering the political war. One is pre-bunking. Pre-bunking is a method that is different from debunking. Debunking is when you hear or when you read a propaganda narrative or some piece of fake news, essentially, some piece of disinformation, and then you're saying, well, this is a lie, and the truth is this and this and this. This is debunking. You're debunking disinformation. But pre-bunking is much more efficient. The reason why the the background of this discussion is coming from psychology, but also from the media studies. Psychologically, a person, when he or she hears some information that is not familiar to them, people used to believe the first interpretation that they hear about those events, about those developments. And what is more, a person would also then defend this first interpretation that they hear against all other interpretations. So if the media, or Russian state-controlled media, produce the first interpretation of a particular development, people just psychologically, they stick to this interpretation. They may change their mind, but at first they will be defending this first interpretation. So what is pre-bunking? Pre-bunking is it's like inoculation. You inoculate. You're producing a vaccine against the disinformation that you may hear in the future. For example, if I tell you that tomorrow Moscow will produce a narrative, Moscow will produce a piece of information about something that will happen, and I will tell you what this interpretation will look like. So when it happens, you will remember my words, and you will also have an understanding that this is actually coming from Moscow. This is actually coming from the Kremlin. One very good example, essentially it's a perfect example of how pre-bunking works, is if we compare the situation in February 2014, when the end of February 2014 and the beginning of March 2014, when the Russians started to occupy Crimea with the use of green little men. Yeah. So many in the West were confused about what was happening. Maybe those are, just pro-Russian separatists or people who didn't like the Maidan, but maybe just a legitimate protest against what was happening in Kiev. So for a couple of weeks, the West was indeed quite confused. Obviously, the secret services and special agencies in the West knew what was happening, but the population was confused, and they could not put any pressure on their authorities to act about, the blatant violation of the international law. But it was very different with February 2022, because the US, the agency, the American agencies, together with their allies, especially in the UK, they pre-bunked what would be happening against Ukraine. So when the full-blown invasion of Ukraine happened on the 24th of February, everybody in the West knew, because they were pre-bunked. They wouldn't believe any disinformation that the Kremlin would produce, because they already knew what was happening. And this is how this is the difference between debunking, what was happening, say, in March 2014, when the Ukrainian authorities tried to explain to everybody, no, the Russian occupation is happening. You need to believe, our truth against the Russian so-called truth. And February 2022, this is how pre-bunking worked. This is about pre-bunking. Another instrument that I believe is very important is actually quite simple, because sometimes it is very efficient just to repeat your information as often as possible. It's a victory by the numbers. If you just flood the information space with your information, with your own narratives, with your own ideas, the numbers will just do their job. It's as simple as that. And this is what the Russians are doing. If you look at how they work, if they look at how the Russian news agencies work, they repeat these lies time and time again, and they do not stop. They produce dozens of thousands of the same messages with the same words. And so, again, psychological, because when we're talking about propaganda, disinformation, it's all about psychology. It's all about how people themselves consume information and what they tend to believe. So just psychologically, if people keep seeing the same sentences, the same ideas every day, they would at some point consider this as the only truth. And everything that rejects these ideas is not a truth, it's a lie. So again, playing with psychology, using psychology to understand the challenge, I think, is one of the major instruments that we can use to counter the Russian propaganda machine.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen, and I'm happy to welcome everyone. My name is Valerie Yonan, and I'm Deputy Minister for Euro Integration at the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine. Since 2019, we have been building the most convenient digital state in the world. Ukraine has become the first country in the world where digital passports are totally equivalent to paper or plastic ones. Our citizens have one of the fastest business registration online in less than 10 minutes. Ukraine also has been called a European digital transformation tiger. To achieve these results quickly and efficiently, we have created DIA, an ecosystem of digital products with our core product, State Super App DIA, which is a game changer of public services with more than 20 million users, 14 digital documents, 30 digital services, and digital signature available in the app.
What is DIA? DIA is a state in a smartphone. It is a super app that cares about millions of Ukrainians on a daily basis. Ukraine is the first country in the world that allows its citizens to use digital passports as an alternative to ID, using which you can open a bank account in one click and travel around the country without originals. Your digital documents and variety of public services are available in one application. No paperwork, no stress, no lines, no bureaucracy. We didn't stop even when the war started. We launched new DIA-based services to help people. Emergency payments were made through the DIA in just a couple of minutes. Every Ukrainian can apply for the internally displayed status, join a job center, or apply for unemployment benefits, report the damages, and apply for compensation. And even apply for the state mortgage without leaving a house, pay all taxes and submit annual tax declaration, or sell and buy auto whenever you're home or abroad. Ukrainians even register their business through the DIA and support state with buying Ukrainian military bonds. State in a smartphone works 24/7, 365 days per year. DIA saves state budget on a daily basis by overcoming corruption. Convenient, invisible, human-centered. This is what DIA really is.
There are also a state portal of public services, DIA, with more than 130 services, DIA Business, National Project on the Development of SMEs, DIA City, the best tax regime for IT in Europe, and of course DIA Education, national edutainment platform for reskilling and digital literacy. On the 24th of February 2022, with the full-scale Russian invasion to Ukraine, the lives of Ukrainians changed, but the digital state has resisted and continues to develop. With DIA, we have reacted fast and launched new services in just 3 days, up to a few weeks. For example, IDP status, social and financial assistance through DIA, e-recovery, chatbot e-enemy, war bonds, and many others.
When the world is falling apart, our main task is to protect the people. After the invasion, DIA acted reactively. We quickly introduced a new set of services vital in extreme situations. Evacuation document combines all personal info in one digital doc and accelerates identification at checkpoints. E-aid, financial support to sole proprietors to keep the economy going. War bonds, aimed at rebuilding the liberated and soon-to-be deoccupied Ukrainian cities. State mortgage, military, medics, teachers, and scientists can apply for the state mortgage right in the app. E-enemy, a chatbot that helps any citizen safely transfer info about the location of Russian troops, names of collaborators, and enemy movements to the armed forces. Numerous attacks of Russian army destroyed a number of TV towers. To provide Ukrainians with uninterrupted access to information, we launched DIA Radio and DIA TV, so that even under blackouts, millions could feel present. And added the in-app Army of Drones game to help Ukrainians both distract and donate to the common purpose. Has the enemy launched cyber attacks on Ukraine? Of course they have, and they failed. Even when the world is falling apart, our main task is to protect the people. Together, we can build a stronger one.
We also embedded DIA TV and DIA Radio in the app, so every Ukrainian can get truthful news by using the DIA app. And digital skills have gained a new meaning. It is not only about how to use new services or how to be competitive on the market, but also about the resistance to disinformation, lots of fakes and active manipulations on the web. With disinformation campaigns, the enemy seeks to undermine the trust of Ukrainian citizens in the state. That is why it is essential to understand how to verify information and communicate safely. If we are building the most convenient digital state in the world, it is important for citizens to have at least basic digital skills. Our strategic goal in the Ministry of Digital Transformation is to teach 6 million of Ukrainians basic digital literacy. And actually, we did it. Moreover, every 2 years, we at the Ministry are conducting research on digital skills among Ukrainians. In 2023, the research shows that 60% of people in Ukraine already have basic and above digital skills. The share has increased by 12.6% in the last 4 years. In 2019, it was only 47%. Regarding media literacy skills, the percentage of citizens among adults without media literacy skills has significantly decreased for almost 10% in 2023. And the rapid increase in the percentage of citizens with media literacy skills above the basic level for 11.6% in 4 years. This year, we also checked the experience of using measures to protect data on the internet regarding a general level of digital skills. Thus, the majority of people with basic and above digital skills always use data protection activities. So, what have we done to help Ukrainians in self-learning and development even in times of war and remain resilient to enemy disinformation campaigns? I will briefly try to cover the key projects and actions. Firstly, we have created a national concept for digital literacy development and encouraged regional adoption of this concept. Then we adopted the European Digital Competence Framework, DigiComp 2.1 and 2.2, to help create public policy and plan educational initiatives on digital literacy. Currently, the framework includes 4 dimensions, 6 areas, 30 competencies, and 6 levels of digital skills. By the way, one of the areas of the digital competence framework is information literacy. This is the critical evaluation of data, information, and digital content. Next step was actually groundbreaking. In May 2023, we relaunched DIA Education. Now it is a national edutainment platform for reskilling and digital literacy. We have implemented reskilling and upskilling concepts in an edutainment format with micro-learning modules and stop lessons. More than 170 educational series, 50 interactive simulators, guides, webinars, and podcasts. There is a lot of content about online safety, cyber hygiene, internet safety rules, online fraud with donations in wartime, how to check fakes, media literacy, personal data, how to use a smartphone safely in the military, digital literacy for civil servants, children and parents, and many others. It is free of charge and available to everyone, and available both in Ukrainian and in English. DIA Education has a unique user flow of learning that allows users from scholars to people of elegant age to learn specific skills by receiving recommended episodes of different series to create their personalized learning trajectory. The essential part of DIA Education is also a network of digital hubs, providing free internet access across libraries, schools, universities, IT organizations, and others. We also implemented digigrams on DIA Education, which are actually national tests to check the level of digital literacy for citizens, teachers, civil servants, medical workers, and others. There is also a cybergram to test the understanding of cyber hygiene, basics, and the ability to protect personal data. As a result, for now, DIA Education reaches 2 million registered users with a 75% success rate, more than 3 million certificates of test or course completion, including about 1 million certificates of the digital literacy test, DigiGrants completion. Also, since autumn 2023, more than 1,400 Ukrainian schools have joined the updated informatics IT studios. Over 300 lessons and 500 interactive exercises have been created to encourage students to practice and develop their skills. We rethought the school subjects and started building the digital culture from the beginning. However, other countries are developing. Thus, there is no other option than to continue on the track we are on. Win the peace, develop human capital, build the country of innovations, and become the most convenient digital state in the world. We have ambitious goals and understand where we need to move forward. We are grateful to the armed forces of Ukraine so we can build the future of Ukraine right now. Ukraine is ready to share experience in digital transformation, digital literacy, digital education, and innovations. We are open for partnerships. Slava Ukraini!
In February 2022, the team of the center began updating the brochure in case of emergency or war. It was a PDF brochure and the dovidka.info website. We released these products on the eve of Russia's full-scale invasion. Later, as the threat was no longer theoretical, but actual, we kept updating the advice on the website and adding new guidelines. It was no longer a question of whether people needed these tips. All that mattered was the format to present them in, so that the step-by-step action plans would be remembered. We approached each point as follows. Following these guidelines, we will also be saving lives, our own, our parents, children, and other loved ones. Currently, dovidka.info is a website with the exact same title, where everything is structured into thematic sections, and where you can find an emergency plan in written format for all cases. Chatbots on Viber and Telegram called Bezpeka Dovidnik. Bezpeka Dovidnik. To keep these tips at hand anytime. Dovidka.info channel on Viber, Instagram and TikTok accounts, so that everyone has access to these guidelines, regardless of which social media people use. Expert interviews on YouTube on the Spravdi channel. There, experts answer questions that most Ukrainians are interested in during the war. Psychology, health, wartime routine, parenting, safety, and education. We also produce guidelines in the format of animated videos. All of them are short and understandable even for children. For example, how not to get trapped on the web, what to do in case of a nuclear threat or when explosions are heard. So, why is media literacy important in the field we work in? Because there is also a lot of disinformation in it. And most critically, a mistake can cost lives. Our main goal is to provide people with verified information. Everyone should be able to find a plan of action in case of a disaster. I'll tell you how to be media literate in this field in the following. First, several examples. When in 2022, Ukrainians were seized with fear that the Russians would launch a nuclear weapon against us, a post with advice on how to escape was spread on social media. Among other things, there was a piece of advice to run away from the epicenter towards the direction of evacuation, immediately after the explosion. This is not the right thing to do. The correct thing to do is to hide in a shelter immediately after the explosion, seal it, carry out decontamination, and wait for the authorities' instructions. This is exactly what we advised in our guidelines, which were actively circulated at the time. We wrote it together with the State Scientific and Technical Center for Nuclear and Radiation Safety. Just imagine how many people could be affected by a Facebook recommendation in the event of a nuclear weapon attack. That's why we don't publish guidelines on our website until they have been thoroughly reviewed by experts. We cooperate with the State Emergency Service, Ministries of Defense, Education, and Health, Cyber Police, and other relevant authorities. On our dovidka.info website, you may not always find the instructions that you can see on social media. For example, there is no guidance on how to supply electricity to a flat using a car battery and an inverter, because it's a dangerous idea. We are also constantly updating the guidelines to make them relevant to our circumstances. Why is this important? In the second year of the war, we have experienced so many dangers that nuclear weapon attack is the only one missing from the list. These dangers are constantly changing, so the guidelines for responding to them must also be updated. For example, the first advice during an air raid alert or shelling is to go to a shelter. But what if the shelter is far away, and ballistic missiles are flying, or the alert sounded after the first explosion? Then you should use another instruction and hide behind two walls, because the advice to go to a shelter if it is far away can be dangerous in this case. Taking this into account, together with the Air Force spokesman Yuri Ihnat, we adapted the plan of action during the shelling. Once we wondered what would happen if the Russians attacked with nuclear weapons, or a nuclear power plant accident occurred, and the children were in schools and kindergartens, while their parents were in other places. It's easy to assume that many people would want to take their children to survive the disaster together. However, this would only cause chaos and even greater danger. After all, the main rule is to hide from radiation in a shelter, carefully seal it, and decontaminate skin, clothing, and surfaces. And parents who come to pick up their child at school or kindergarten, taking him or her out of a sealed shelter, will endanger not only themselves, but also their child and everyone else in the shelter. But the specialized authorities had no guidelines for this particular case. Then, together with the Ministry of Education and Science and the State Center for Nuclear and Radiation Safety, we wrote a comprehensive plan on how parents and teachers should act in this situation. Schools and kindergartens have already received it. The guidelines that existed long before the war are often outdated or not applicable to all cases, because they were written when the danger was far away. But now the danger is here, and now, so we, together with experts, often update the guidelines and add new explanations to them. An example is the manual on the rules of staying in a shelter. According to the order, which was last updated in 2018, pets are not allowed in the shelter. However, in the context of a real war, these rules need to be revised. We have all seen photos of Ukrainians taking shelter in the metro with their pets. And we remember the public outrage when 2 children with a dog were not allowed to enter a school shelter in Kiev when ballistic missiles were flying at Kiev. We turned to the State Emergency Service, and upon request, were told that, together with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, they are already preparing amendments to this order. Top tips on how and where to look for proven emergency guidelines, and how to apply them in practice. When you see guidelines, always ask yourself the question, who is the source? If it's a Facebook post from an unknown author, always check this action plan with information from the relevant agencies, the State Emergency Service, the Ministry of Health, the police, and with the website, dovidka.info, which contains tips for all cases. Get into the habit of reading guidelines in advance, not when the emergency has already occurred. It is difficult to filter information in a state of shock and fear, but by studying it in advance, you will know how to act. We also advise you to save these guidelines as bookmarks, notes, or screenshots on your phone. Both you and your family should have a single plan for everyone. Everyone should know what they will do if there is shelling, a fire, a house collapse, or a connection failure. Talk about how each of you will act in advance. Be a role model for children. Children learn from your behavior. If you ignore the alert, you give them a signal that there is no threat, or that it is exaggerated. If you don't have an emergency suitcase because you don't think you'll have to evacuate, it's also a signal that you are confident that the threat will pass you by. During a war, both children and adults need to understand that there is always a threat, and only those who know exactly what to do will survive. Another piece of advice that relates mostly to guidelines for when there is no gas, water, or electricity. When you buy appliances that will help you to keep the heat or light on, read the rules for handling them and the things you shouldn't do. This applies, for example, to generators or potbelly stoves. If you do not follow the rules of use, an essential tool for blackouts can cause a fire. It is extremely important to know the safety rules. Promote safety awareness in your environment. Get organized with your housemates if you live in a block of flats. Talk to your child's teachers at school to see if they have a plan of action for different emergencies. The same goes for your colleagues at the office. A good example: the residents of a house in the Solomyansky district of the capital that suffered from the attack on 2nd January. People organized themselves, bought fire extinguishers for each flat, and invited the State Emergency Service to conduct a fire safety training. May you be such an example. Even if you never have to go through what these people did, you will be prepared in case of the worst scenario.
Hello, my name is Gabriele Cosentino. I am assistant professor at the American University in Cairo. And in this brief presentation today, I will be talking to you about the post-truth era, discussing both the causes and possible solution of this problem, of this phenomenon. So in Europe and in the United States, since about 2016, there has been a lot of discussion, research, and awareness campaigns on the issues of disinformation, propaganda, and public opinion manipulation, especially what is happening through social media and the internet. The problem has appeared so serious and so pervasive that it has been suggested that we now live in the era of post-truth. In the current era of global network communications, in which billions of people are creating content that spreads with lightning speed around the world, truth seems to have become kind of a slippery, even fading notion. And studies have actually demonstrated that false information spreads online faster than truthful content. And false information now, unfortunately, we know that has impacted in a serious way many aspects of our life, from public health to politics to the environment. And in the slides, you have a living testimony that we are actually in the post-truth era. So the questions that I will be addressing in these presentations are, what does post-truth mean? And what are the causes and possible solutions to this problem? So we can define post-truth as a condition in which the public opinion tends to rely more on emotions such as rage or fear than on objective facts in establishing the truth. And what are the causes of this particular condition that we seem to have been slipped into since a few years? Most discussions of the phenomenon, most research on this phenomenon have focused on the role of technology, from ubiquitous smartphones to social media, who actually play a big role in enabling deceptive, manipulative, or malign content. And it has been established definitely by research that technology greatly facilitates the dissemination of false information. Technology companies such as Meta or X who are racing among each other to capture our attention and to turning into money, to monetize it, have rushed to implement on their platforms features such as, for example, recommendation algorithms that have significantly worsened the problem. Social media have also been blamed for locking people into so-called filter bubbles, information bubbles in which people are exposed to content which is always similar, more and more of the same content, because these are the logics of the algorithm, giving people more of the same. And this has actually been demonstrated that is conducive to the spread of mis- and disinformation. Software automation on social media and other platforms have also been used to push deceptive content, usually via so-called bots, which are software agents that perform repeatedly automated tasks, automated operations. These are actually frequently used in disinformation campaigns by Russia, and this has been extensively researched, as well as other countries such as China or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for example, who have developed very sophisticated tools and tactics to conduct disinformation campaign via social media. And now that we're entering the new technological era of generative AI, which is developing at a very fast pace, it's actually bound to further worsen this problem, as we have seen already in the proliferation of fake images and deepfake videos. There has been, luckily, a recognition of this problem by technology companies, by technology executives, for example, Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, as well as by policymakers, which have grown increasingly worried by the impact of misinformation and disinformation on politics, and by regular citizens who have seen their lives impacted by it. Still, big global technology companies continue to benefit a lot from the spread of false information, because ultimately false information drives engagement, drives traffic, and this turns into revenue. There have been also other perspectives, other approaches to explain what are the mechanisms favoring the spread of false information online. And these are approaches which have focused on psychological, social, and cultural factors. For example, research has demonstrated that we as humans, we have an innate attraction towards outlandish, provocative, and sensational content. And we also follow certain cognitive defensive mechanisms, such as so-called confirmation bias, which make us look for information that confirms our pre-existing views, our pre-existing beliefs, even if these are false. There are also other dynamics studied by researchers, such as in-group or out-group dynamics, which means that people, when they belong to online communities, they tend to defend their identity, the belonging to a group, often attacking through disinformation other groups, or sometimes spreading false information can be used as a signal to be part of a community. So these are all factors, these are all mechanisms that have been studied and offered as an explanation for this broader post-truth era. As far as possible solutions that have been suggested and already implemented to the problem, we have already noticed that, especially since the pandemic, technology platforms as well as various initiatives by news organizations and fact-checking organizations have implemented features aimed at moderating content, at verifying information. And this is a very sensitive, very important effort, especially during an election. And 2024 is a very important election year in many countries around the world. So it's essential that content moderation and fact-checking efforts are put into place to make sure that disinformation and misinformation do not negatively impact the course of an election. Other potential remedies, potential solutions that have been offered and already implemented are the development of media and news literacy program. And these are all efforts and initiatives which are aimed at giving people and citizens important critical skills necessary to navigate the increasingly complex information ecosystem of today. And here I am showing some of the fundamental and basic things that users can do whenever they are encountering a piece of information online to check its veracity, to check its source, to check the author, to focus on various details and various aspects which are all part of a verification process. And a media literacy education, it's aimed as equipping users with this knowledge, with this tools. These are all absolutely fundamental and important perspective and solution. But remains a big and broader question at the heart of the problem of post-truth. Why do people create and consume disinformation? And why, in the current age, emotions have become more important than facts in public discourse? And why, ultimately, are people so fearful and so enraged, so driven by emotions, and thus more vulnerable to manipulation? In my view, a crisis of truth is, at its heart, a crisis of trust. In most cases, we as citizens, we as individuals, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the education, we don't have the time even to really establish the truth, especially on complex issues such as the economy or public health issues. We need to rely on institutions and authorities who can do the assessment and the verification for us. But this especially in a democracy, requires trust. It requires that we trust the institutions. Unfortunately, a growing number of people in Western countries don't trust traditional media, don't trust institutions and politicians anymore. This makes them more disoriented and more vulnerable to manipulation and influence. So, post-truth and the lack of trust is not a technical problem. It's not even a cognitive or psychological problem. In my interpretation, is ultimately a political problem. If people trust their leaders, their institution, their media, with respect to fundamental issues such as the economy, for example, or the environment, or security, then and only then there can be the necessary foundations to have a well-informed public sphere, which is necessary for the democratic process. So for me, the most durable, the most solid solution to post-truth is actually to rebuild trust, to rebuild citizens' trust in their government, in policy making, in society, and also in the economy. This is a much more complex goal to attain. Technical solutions are important, but they're not, of course, enough to really rebuild the foundation of trust that is needed to have a truthful public conversation. It's complex because it involves a significant revision, a significant discussions of the values underlying our society, and a discussion also of the type of society that we want to live in. But only if we can rebuild this trust, we can protect ourselves from the propaganda and the manipulations of the enemies of democracy, such as the current Russian government, or the Chinese government, or the Iranian government, or all the other autocratic regimes around the world who are preying on our weaknesses. If we want to solve the problem of post-truth, we have to rebuild a society where we trust each other. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Igor Solovey. I am the head of the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security at the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy. Mass murders in Bucha and Izyum, missile attacks on the railway station in Kramatorsk and the village of Groza in Kharkiv region, the destroying of Mariupol with the bombing of a maternity hospital and a drama theater, in the basements of which parents and children were hiding. This incomplete list of occupiers' crimes against the civilian population is far from being complete. And all these crimes, are they occasional excesses? Or maybe they are part of the Putin regime's policy of genocide against all Ukrainians? We at the Center for Strategic Communications and Information Security were looking for an answer to this question in our study, Genocidal Rhetoric of the Russian Regime, which was presented in 2023. Generally speaking, genocide is the most serious crime in the list of international crimes, and proving it in court is a very difficult task. Therefore, the identification of genocidal rhetoric by government officials is an important step in proving that their actions were intended to commit genocide. After all, international law allows the above-mentioned and other episodes to be qualified both as acts of genocide and as war crimes or crimes against humanity. First of all, it is worth understanding what is meant by the definition of genocidal rhetoric. Its components include calls for genocide. It also includes approving or neutral coverage of crimes against a group, here Ukrainians, which is being subjected to genocide. Also the use of euphemisms, that is, these are mitigating or disguising expressions that are used instead of words that are perceived as undesirable. They are usually used to dehumanize victims and justify crimes against them. The elements of the crime of genocide include not only the murder of members of a particular national, ethnic, or religious group, but also the causing of severe physical or mental harm to its members, the deliberate creation of living conditions aimed at its destruction, and the forced transfer of children to another group. So, to understand whether the Russian regime really intends to commit genocide against Ukrainians, we, at the Center for Strategic Communications, examined Russian legislation, public statements by Russian President Putin and other representatives of his regime, as well as the content of state media and school manuals for genocidal rhetoric. The latter are produced by order and under the control of the government, and therefore reflect its official position. This work revealed that Russian legislation contains a number of regulations aimed at discriminating against both Russian citizens of Ukrainian ethnic origin and Ukrainians living in the occupied territories. The activities of Ukrainian organizations are prohibited in Russia. Any involvement in them is subject to administrative and even criminal liability. The use of the Ukrainian language has been forced out of the public space, and the total Russification of education is ongoing, which is part of the linguistic war. Also, during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian authorities adopted a number of other legislative acts that create a legal framework for committing crimes that constitute genocide. It is about restricting the rights of Ukrainians who have not received a Russian passport, about forced deportations from the occupied territories. The Kremlin regime pays special attention to the deportation of children. It was precisely for the illegal transfer of Ukrainian children from Ukraine that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Putin and his Russian official, Maria Lvova-Belova, the children's ombudsman of Russia. All of us around us are also witnessing how Russian propaganda continues to dehumanize and demonize Ukrainians, issuing threats to use nuclear weapons and calling for murder. Genocidal rhetoric is used not only by participants of propaganda talk shows or administrators of anonymous Telegram channels. The non-recognition of Ukrainians as a separate nation with the right to their own national identity and sovereign state is part of the rhetoric of the Russian authorities. For this purpose, Putin and his subordinates engage in pseudo-scientific discussions about the origin of the words Ukraine and Ukrainians. They derive these phrases from the Russian word Ukraina, outskirts, and thus demonstrate the inauthenticity of the Ukrainian language. These statements are supposed to prove that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. The non-recognition of the existence of the Ukrainian people can also be found in official documents, in particular in those acts by which the Kremlin is trying to legally register its illegal attempts to annex the occupied territories. The mythical people of the Kherson region, of the Zaporizhia region, of Crimea, and even the people of the LPR and DPR are mentioned. And representatives of the Russian authorities regularly refer to Ukrainians as Nazis, fascists, sometimes with the prefix neo, nationalists, and Banderites. All of these terms are interchangeable in Russian political discourse and have a strong negative connotation. They are used as euphemisms for dehumanizing Ukrainians and justifying aggression and other crimes. Let me remind you that the former president of Russia and current deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, imitates the rhetoric of Rwandan radio 1000 Hills when he compares Ukrainians to cockroaches and pigs in his Telegram channel and describes Ukraine's international partners as Western pig herds. The pages of state media contain materials that both repeat the aforementioned rhetoric and rationalize the genocide of Ukrainians and contain specific recommendations for its implementation. The most notable example of this is the article, "What Russia Should Do with Ukraine," published on the website of the RIA Novosti state news agency on 3rd of April 2022. Its author, political strategist Timofey Sergeytsev, insists on the need for the physical elimination of the Ukrainian political class and military on mass repression, ethnic cleansing, and total de-Ukrainization, which should even include the rejection of the word Ukraine. All the texts by Sergeytsev and his associates actually decipher the term denazification in the sense used by Putin and other representatives of the Russian regime. This means the prohibition of Ukrainian national identity and the physical destruction of its bearers. School history textbooks also contribute to the formation of prejudiced, arrogant, and negative attitudes towards Ukrainians. They are portrayed as people incapable of creating their own state and as carriers of a culture that is at least inferior to the Russian one. For these textbook authors, supporters of independence and the European vector of Ukraine's development are traitors and enemies. And the key theses of state propaganda about the revolution of dignity as a coup d'etat, Ukrainian Nazis, the artificiality of Ukrainian identity, and so on, have been incorporated into high school textbooks. The conspiracy theory that Ukrainians were allegedly invented by the Austrian General Staff to divide the united Russian people has also become part of the textbook content. The authors of these textbooks, just like the Kremlin, deny the artificial and genocidal nature of the Holodomor of 32 to 33 in Ukraine, diminish its scale, and justify its organizers. This can also be considered part of genocidal rhetoric. Thus, the analysis conducted by the Center for Strategic Communications suggests that the sources representing the position of the Russian regime contain elements of genocidal rhetoric, and the policy of the Russian state as a whole is aimed at creating conditions for the crime of genocide against Ukrainians, justifying this crime and encouraging Russian society to support it. The existence of the Ukrainian nation is denied by Russian propaganda at the state level, and the representatives of Ukrainian identity are dehumanized with euphemisms. Russian state media regularly publish articles aimed at justifying and rationalizing the genocide of Ukrainians and the destruction of the Ukrainian state. Russian legislation contains a number of measures that discriminate against Ukrainians and legalize genocidal practices. Therefore, this study by the Center for Strategic Communications, which I have described, will be attached by the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine to the criminal case on the investigation of the crime of genocide, which is currently being carried out by the Russian Federation.
Hello, my name is Kari Kivinen, and I'm representing Finnish Faktabari. Faktabari is a Finnish fact-checking organization which has specialized in digital information literacy. Why is that? It's because when we do fact checks about the disinformation which is online, we have noticed that only very little number of people who are receiving the disinformation receive our correction. So we have decided that we want to give a kind of tools for people, especially young people, teachers, how to resist disinformation, how to find disinformation online. And we have been adapting fact checkers, professional fact checkers tools to the school environments. And I will share a little presentation with you, and please follow me. So first of all, in Europe, we have defined what is a person which is digitally competent. We have this target that by 2030, 80% of the population have basic digital skills. And part of these basic digital skills are, for example, following things. That people are aware that online environments contain all kinds of information, including misinformation and disinformation. That people are able to know how to differentiate, for example, sponsored content from other online content, and know how to analyze and critically evaluate the online search results. And what is more important also, that there is this willingness to verify the information we see. Very quickly, in Europe, we are using the information disorder definitions, where misinformation is a mistake. All the press, me in this speech, I can make mistakes. When I notice that I've made a mistake, I correct it. We all make mistakes. Misinformation in Europe means that. But disinformation is a lie. It's a false or misleading information which is created, presented, and disseminated for some purpose. And normally these purposes are not very good ones. And it can cause serious public harm. The third one is malinformation, it might be a correct information, but it's used against to harm somebody. And for example, hate speech or nasty gossips are like that. So when we are speaking with children, we can speak about mistake, lie, and gossip. Why action is needed is that according to the European different research, 70% of the Europeans come quite often across the disinformation. 80% thinks that it's a problem, and 81% thinks that it's even a problem for the democracy. Because so that people can make, for example, in elections, which we have in many countries this year, you can base your choice of the party or the person on facts and not wrong information. And from the students' point of view, the problem is that the screen time has been increasing horribly, and students and children get their news from different kind of sources than we adults. TikTok, Snapchat, WhatsApp, and other sources where we don't know what the information they get. So about the half of the European students say that they have been taught that there is some kind of problem with online information, only half. And about 1/3 are underperforming when they are evaluating the online content. This is a new statistics about Europe, the people who have seen untrue or doubtful information in the internet. And for example, my country, Finland, is leading here because we are speaking a lot about that in Finnish press, in Finnish schools. People are looking for the if there is wrong information, and that's good. But there are countries where there is much less attention paid for the online content. What is the difference between the information literacy and digital information literacy? In the good old times, libraries were the places where if you want to know something about the giraffe or elephant, you could go to the library, you could ask librarian, where can I find books and information about these animals? And the books are classified clearly, easy to find information on whatever subject. And there were books where you could find information. Nowadays, we all have mobile phones with Google or other browsers and search engines. And the responsibility to find information from the non-classified universe of all kind of things is left to us, and also for children and youngsters. So suddenly we are not benefiting the structured information classification, but we are supposed to be ourselves able to find the information we are looking for. That's why in Faktabari we are absolutely promoting the digital information literacy, which is the ability to access, manage, and understand, evaluate, disseminate information safely and appropriately through digital technologies. And it's something quite recent. In the last days or months, or actually after the November 22, generative AI has changed this picture again. And with these new wonderful Gen AI tools, it's much more easier to create deep fakes, wrong information which looks absolutely correct. And the digital information literacy is even more important now. In Faktabari, we have created a lot of materials, texts, and background information, which you can freely download from our site about the phenomena and about how to react and what to do for that. So we are proposing that there are new types of online reading skills and strategies to be learned in the online environments. So the traditional reading skills are helpful, absolutely needed, but they should be complemented with new online assessment strategies and online literacy skills to tackle disinformation. So according to the research, pre-bunking, debunking, strategic ignorance, lateral reading are quite, effective ways to tackle disinformation. And I will explain some of them quickly. Lateral reading means that if you're doing, for example, a Google search, you get 300,000 results. You have to be aware that among the results, the Google and other platforms, search engines, they are promoting so-called sponsored content. So you can buy visibility for your information. Also, there are technical tools to optimize your information. And when we are making a search, it's not really serving our needs of information, but maybe the people who would like to spread commercial or other type of information, who are kind of giving money to the platforms so that we see first. So instead of taking the first hit or the second hit, even touching it, we should check maybe who is behind that information, and maybe by opening a new tab, looking a little bit, is this truthful source, and so on. So the lateral reading means that you are not analyzing every single hit you get, because you would get old with that. We have a limited concentration span. We should be very selective on what we read and what we analyze. So there are two different dimensions in the online text. So first of all, the accuracy of the text, the quality of the arguments, comparing with other text, comparing with the previous knowledge. If you find something which is sounding strange and not really fitting your previous knowledge, you should be suspicious. But the second part is the assessment of the reliability of the source. Is it made by somebody? Can you find a writer? Is it a well-known, reliable source? And also, is it written or created by an expert of this particular area? Because there are a lot of experts in online environment, self-made experts. So these are the kind of components one has to look. And we have kind of, in the Faktabari, we have kind of summarized it for the three main questions. When you are seeing online news, which is a bit suspicious, check who is spreading the claim, what is the source, what is the evidence that has been presented to support the claim, and what do other sources have to say. So you can open new tabs and check, is this really true? We have also made a little video where in English where you can check and maybe show with your students or with your children at home how to do this three questions evaluation. I already mentioned the artificial intelligence. So I love artificial intelligence and generative AI tools. They are really wonderful. The problem is that even the Gen AI platforms say that, sorry, our tool might invent things. Our tool is not perfect, and it's called hallucination. So even the OpenAI platform is stating openly that our tool can create not truthful information about the people, about the sources, and about the facts. So everything we get from the artificial intelligence, we should verify. And this is the issue where we need, once again, digital information literacy and good knowledge on the suspect we are looking for. With artificial intelligence, it's wonderful tool to make nice photos, but it can also be used to create fake, deep fakes, modified photos, and to use them, they look perfectly right, and use them in a wrong context. That's why we have created a game. In browsers, you can choose the language about artificial intelligence photos. Can you find which is the real one? And it's really difficult. And our instructions for the artificial intelligence users is that never ever share any information which you have received from the artificial intelligence, which might have mistakes. So you should assess critically any response produced by an online tool, and never copy directly the output of the GenAI to any documents, and never rely on the GI tool answers in a time-sensitive processes. So what we would like to say is that we should all be inspired by the wonderful opportunities of the online, but we should learn and teach critical digital skills. So first, become a critical online information user ourselves, teach it to our students and our children and our friends, and also to our grandparents, and use it in our everyday life safely. So this is a shortcut of our information. Thank you.
Propaganda is one of the oldest tools invented by mankind to influence people. From the ancient stories and achievements of Ignatius of Loyola to the modern world of cutting-edge technologies and global networks, propaganda, far from losing its position, but significantly expanded its possibilities of influence. Propaganda has always tried to fill the whole space of human life, in education, medicine, religion, literature, art, and media. Propaganda is found in computer games, comic books, murals, memes, and even in cemeteries. It always appeals to emotions. It always plays with feelings, both on the worthy and the vile. Propaganda continues to be the subject of research by many experts in various fields. A Google search shows about 50,000 publications in Ukrainian and more than 30 million publications in English. However, discussions about understanding this phenomenon often resemble the well-known parable of the blind men and an elephant. And the point is not only that each of the blind men perceived only a part of the whole, and that they could not understand the system only by the parts that belong to it. The parable of an elephant and the blind men demonstrates the concepts of truth and delusion. Postmodernism did a great service to propaganda because it questioned the concept of truth and turned knowledge into an interpretation of judgments. Jürgen Habermas rightly pointed out that the philosophy of postmodernism led to the collapse of a holistic worldview into independent perceptions of separate groups of experts. Experts mostly mention that propaganda is the deliberate spread of certain ideas, values, norms, and behavioral programs in society, or that it is a systematic form of deliberate persuasion that attempts to influence the emotions, attitudes, opinions, and actions of a specific target audience for political, ideological, or commercial purposes through the supervised transmission of one-sided messages. That propaganda is strong in its systematic nature, as it uses verbal and visual means to build a required vision of the world, and the discussions mainly concern the extent to which propaganda is deceptive, manipulative, open, or hidden. And we can agree with many of the statements. However, just like in the parable of the blind men, this will only be a part of the whole. For many researchers, the challenge of finding effective solutions to counter propaganda is the obvious underestimation of its essence and the specifics of interaction in the information society. The crisis of liberal democracy, the influence of populist ideas and leaders, the devaluation of knowledge and information overload have led to the transformation and increased influence of propaganda, which has already become institutionalized. In the current context, propaganda should be considered through the prism of three global problems of humanity: the crisis of trust as a consequence of the post-truth era, the crisis of expertise in the face of alternative facts, and the crisis of attention as a result of lack of focus. The situation was complicated by the discourse of populism, where propaganda offers simple answers to complex questions. The postmodern approach is one in which everything is questioned and little is taken for granted. There is no right answer, only a narrative. Science has lost its monopoly on truth. The value of truthfulness decreased. Concepts of propaganda and pluralism of opinions have been replaced. Research shows that different audiences have begun to prefer alternative facts and rumors to official information and scientific expertise. The implementation of the idea of alternative facts has already become the basis of Russian policy, and this is already showing results not only in Russian society. This strategy has been used by populist leaders around the world. When people do not want to take responsibility for their lives, that is, refuse to be free, they prefer to be lulled by propaganda delusions. Then the world is perceived through simulacra and understandable narratives. And in this mindset, statements such as Ukraine attacked Russia, Russia is only defending its interests, Russians and Ukrainians are one people and have one language, Ukrainians are Nazis, the war is fueled and escalated by those countries that supply weapons to Ukraine, no longer look absurd, because it is known that the sleep of the mind creates monsters. The results of a number of experiments and studies show that the human psyche is not designed to withstand the kind of manipulative pressure that modern propaganda and related PR can produce. Therefore, for many people, disengagement becomes the most convenient way out. Indifference is one of the biggest threats to democracy and freedom of speech. The erosion of democracy began with indifference to what is true. This is where the crisis of trust in the democratic system, demagoguery, disinformation, and alternative news comes from. Propaganda in the past aimed to convince people of the truth and benefits of their ideology and way of life. Modern propaganda, in particular Russian propaganda, tries to prove that there is no truth at all, that everything is not so clear. Doubt has become a convenient way to destroy the set of facts in the minds of the wide public. And then, don't look up becomes a life strategy not only for ordinary citizens, but also for leaders of countries. Thus, Russia is gaining another victory in a small propaganda war. Therefore, we must not forget that without the ability to perceive the reality of things in a cognitive sense, humanity will be increasingly tempted to the opposite attitude to reality, which can be called cognitive escape. Russia has shown that it can easily blur the lines between fact and blatant lies. And as Peter Pomerantsev, a researcher of Russian propaganda, rightly notes, if the truth does not exist, then anything is possible. That is why the Russian-Ukrainian war is not only an existential war for Ukrainians for their existence and freedom. It is a global war for the right to existence of the truth, because a world where there is no truth and no one can be trusted is condemned to destruction and death. When analyzing propaganda, Researchers often ask the question of whether a person or humanity as a whole can develop psychological immunity, the ability to withstand threatening information. They discuss what could become a kind of antidote to the influence of propaganda. I am very skeptical about this. The creators of propaganda campaigns are probably aware of the many studies on the functioning of the human psyche, its sensitive points or delusions. And this process cannot be stopped. Moreover, artificial intelligence has joined in. Man is a very plastic creature. His behavior is determined not by reality, but by his perception of that reality. Friedrich Nietzsche called man an indefinite animal. Man combines many open features. This gives him freedom and multiple possibilities, as well as space for contradictory processes. Therefore, in addition to calls for critical thinking and efforts to identify fake news, we need to ask questions about rethinking the foundations of our existence. We should listen to the advice of the French philosopher Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, namely, to study in order to be able to do more in order to act more in order to exist more fully. And perhaps, then, we will not perceive propaganda as blind men in the parable about an elephant, but will understand its strength and weakness, and we will look up.
Hi everyone, my name is Olga Pasitselska. I will be presenting today this topic of media literacy education for older adults. I am assistant professor at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And this is a project that I did together with Ukrainian Media and Communication Institute in Kiev and with Deutsche Welle Academy. It was supported by the German Cooperation Foundation. And I will leave the contacts in the end of this presentation. So if you want to also look at what my colleagues are doing now, you can also contact them directly. So I started this research from assumption that is also pervasive in academic circles, but also probably in the general society, that older people are more vulnerable to disinformation and propaganda. And why is that? Why do we think that older people might be more vulnerable? And one of the answers is because they might be vulnerable because they don't know how to use digital tools, because they lack digital literacy. They were born in this earlier period when digital tools were not available, so they learn how to use them in the later stage of life. So they don't know how to use digital tools, and therefore they might be more vulnerable to digital and digitally spread fakes and disinformation. So in this research, we were trying to go back and maybe check first, so how they're using digital tools, and how they're using media in general, and then what do they think about it? Do they feel like they are more vulnerable to disinformation and to digital propaganda, or do they actually have some strategies to cope with that? And as the end goal of this project, we want to also create materials that might help older generations with their media literacy skills. So in this presentation, I will briefly go through the results of our study. We will talk a little bit about how older people in Ukraine, meaning 60 plus, use media and digital media. Then we will go through the focus group data and results to understand what they think about it. And then we will have some practical tips or advice also for older people, how maybe to improve their digital literacy skills, but also for practitioners. And lastly, I will talk a little bit about further research direction, where can we go from there? So let's start with the survey data. So based on this national survey that we conducted, this year in Ukraine, we know that 60% of, almost 60.5% of older adults in Ukraine use mobile smartphones, so phones with connection to the internet. However, there are many differences also between men and women, also between different age groups, also between rural and urban population in the sense, but also between regions, different regions of Ukraine. So specifically, you see on this table that there is a stark difference between two age categories. So if people 60 to 69 use smartphones a lot, from 70 plus, this number drops significantly. Also, there is a difference between city and village. And then again, there is a difference between, for instance, east and west of Ukraine. So in the east, many more people use smartphones than in the west, which is an interesting finding, I think, and we can think about why. And then most older adults also use television as their main source of news, which is a kind of a finding that we can think of from the top of our head, even without conducting research. This is something that everybody assumes. However, the full picture is much more complex, and often people use multiple sources. So, of course, most people use television, but also many of them consume news on digital platforms and on Telegram, for instance, on YouTube. And other media are much less significant. So, for instance, newspapers and radio are not really important sources of news for older people anymore. And you also see here differences between different age groups. So, for instance, for the population 70 plus, television is still kind of a dominant source, and they use digital media to much lesser extent. But for people from 60 to 69, this is actually digital media use is much more widespread. Why older people use internet and digital media? So obviously, given the war in Ukraine, people use digital media mostly for news, but also to keep in touch with their friends, family, social connections. They also search information quite a lot, so information and advice, and to lesser extent, but still significantly for entertainment and for paying bills, for instance. Only 37.6% use the governmental service DIA, which I think is a important finding, and also this should be something important for policymakers to understand. Okay, so our app reaches only a very limited segment of the older adults, and we need to do something with that. What kind of software applications older adults use? So most of them use messengers. Also, 80% use YouTube. To a little bit less extent, they use search engines and social media. And now you can see that actually 50% use DIA. So in the previous question, it was, okay, what is the goal of using digital media? And here, are you using it at all? So 50% use it in general, but maybe they do not use it so frequently. So there is this difference of 20%. But you see that here, like music and video and things like that are almost not at all used by the older populations. Okay, so now we have a certain understanding of what software, what applications, and why older people use digital media at all. And now we can dive deeper into what they think about it and how do they feel about it. Are they confident using this media, or do they feel maybe uncertain or unsafe? Now we will ask questions about their own abilities. So how can they assess quality of information? What do they think, how they can assess it? How do they can assess quality on traditional media versus online media? And then what do they think about how can they search social media. So this is self-reporting data, so it's of course biased, but it is still important to understand. So a larger share of our survey participants are quite confident that they understand how social media work, and then they can rather confidently assess the quality of information that they find. We don't see much difference between online and traditional media, so it's only 5 to 7-8% the difference there, which means that older adults not necessarily think that they are weaker critical thinkers on digital media. They actually approach this as a homogeneous or one media sphere, and they assess their critical skills almost equally in traditional media and digital media. So this is the difference between men and women. So men think about themselves as more confident users, and women are more modest in this sense, which I think is also important to understand the gender differences here. And these are also differences between different regions in Ukraine, which I think is also a result of intense propaganda campaign by Russia. So people who live in the east of Ukraine feel less confident that they can distinguish between true and false news than people in the west of Ukraine. Okay, so let's now try and dig deeper into what people, what are kind of perceptions in general about news consumption, information search, information verification, and we will do this with a focus group data. Okay, since a little bit of a longer quote, but I think it's important to understand how people use media and what they think when they do so. So somebody, a woman in Mykolaiv Oblast says, during the day on the Telegram, Nikolaevsky Novosti and Nikvesti, and I read Kim all the time, Sienkiewicz, on Facebook, Instagram, Telegram. This is how I keep up to date. Well, there's also Nikolaevsky Vanyok on Telegram, and I read it occasionally. Plus other local Mykolaiv chats, Mykolaiv 24/7, and just Mykolaiv chat. That's where I get the information from. So you see here that, at least in this response, she doesn't really distinguish between anonymous sources, verified sources, journalistic media, or just anonymous Telegram channels. Also, there is almost, and yeah, I think no mention of journalistic sources whatsoever, or what of traditional media. And probably this is not a media diet that you think about when you think about older adults. But actually, many of them are really connected to messengers, to Telegram. They know about all of these chats and groups, and they want to keep up to date with this information, and this is how they do this. So most of it is social media and messenger sources. We also asked our participants, so how do you conduct search in search engines? Most of them do this in Google. So we actually found that they do not have any clear criteria when they make a question or formulate a question or search line. So how do they actually choose which link to click? So this was from the focus group, and one man said, I start with the first one, I don't like it, then I leave this page and then I check the other link. And then another man confirms and say same thing, the same. Is there any other way? This is the easiest one. You check the first one, then the second one, and so forth. This is from Ternopil Oblast. So what we see here is actually they not distinguish between, for instance, sponsored content or usually the first link in the search is some kind of a promoted content or advertisement. So they do not make distinctions between those, and this might be problematic in the information search endeavors. Okay, what about kind of mindsets that people approach the media with? So some of them say that I am quite critical and I don't actually trust anyone. So I don't trust anyone. All information is full of lies. I don't really know how to check it. So I would be kind of critical and to every information I encounter. And this is quite problematic if you think about it, because it's hard to be critical all the time. You need some trusted sources. You cannot be fact-checking all day long. So this type of mindset might be quite problematic. So maybe you need to think about how to counter this type of all-encompassing criticism towards the media. Another maybe problematic mindset is I'm just an ordinary person type. So some older people say there is too much information, we can't really make sense of it, we cannot really filter it because we are just ordinary people and it's not our job to do this. And this kind of, this position lacks agency, so people feel helpless and hopeless, and they, from the outstart, approach the media with this kind of mindset that they cannot make sense of it, which is also not good for staying informed and for their critical media use. And finally, another quote is, so people think that they do not have enough time to actually keep up to date, to check the media. And this is also problematic because if you think that to be informed, you just need to sit near the television or near with the telephone from morning to evening, then you kind of also give up on staying informed. So maybe we can try and explain that it doesn't take so much time. And if you want to dig deeper when you have time, of course, but to stay up to date in basic sense, you can just pick up 2, 3, 4 trusted sources, check them once a day, and that's it. So this is another kind of problematic mindset. But at the same time, we find in our data that older people are generally skeptical towards the media, but it might be actually good and productive because they do not trust anything they meet online or offline. They also quite adamant in using multiple sources, comparing between different media, and they also often compare official media, we have a marathon, a news marathon on TV with online media, for instance, Telegram channels. So they do this kind of cross-media, cross-check. And also they are quite aware that there is a censorship, state censorship going on, and they know about ownership of media channels. So they are quite proficient in the sense, and we not necessarily need to teach them all of these things. Okay, so now to the practical advice. What to focus on when we think about also for older people themselves, how they can maybe improve their digital literacy skills, but also for practitioners that think about designing courses, for instance. So some areas that we think that older people might be weaker at are search algorithms. So they do not have clear criteria of how to filter search results and how to find information in a correct way. Privacy. So I didn't show you this data for the sake of time, but many of older people think that it's not really necessary to create long passwords, and it doesn't matter what they post online because who is interested in me? I'm just an ordinary retired person, and so forth. So maybe we need to make them more alert and more aware about how also social media algorithms might use their data, but also that it is maybe dangerous in many senses to put personal information online, etc. And the third area is kind of to make them maybe understand better what kind of channels or sources are social media and messaging apps versus verified journalistic media and content. So there is quite a gray area, and it's still developing, and it's really hard to have all this criteria set up for, especially for the Telegram channels, that is quite a new actor in a media sphere. So we need to maybe try to explain them how to drive clearer boundaries between verified and unverified, anonymous and trusted sources. What are challenges when also for older people when try to learn media literacy, but also for teachers and practitioners who try to teach them media literacy. So we also conducted several interviews with experts, and also with combined data from these interviews and from focus groups. We think that it might be hard for older adults to switch position from kind of authoritative adult and grown-up person to a student position again in later life. So this kind of switch might be challenging, so you need to invest more time and resources in this switch to start learning, to kind of be open to learning. Then older people might need more motivation to learn digital literacy skills, because for young people, kind of learning is part of their lives. It comes naturally. They do not need additional motivation. But for older adults, they might need some boost in motivation, and there might be some additional benefits, for instance, to socialize with other people, to be part of a community, to come and chat and have just a good time. Might be initial initiative, not only to become more aware about fakes or algorithms. We also found that it's quite important for older adults to have their materials based on local media, local sources. They are very aware of what's going on in their town, city, village, etc. And they want to know more. They want to know local news. Usually it's very important for them. So also the programs and materials should focus on that. And finally, digital literacy or digital skills training should precede digital literacy in general. So of course, you need to first learn how to use your phone to then filter the news there. So digital skills training should be a component in any digital literacy training, but probably it shouldn't be the goal in itself. So we want to teach people to use their mobile phones, but for what? So there should be a next step. And finally, where do we go from here? So first of all, answering the question that I posed in the beginning, why are older adults more vulnerable, and are they actually more vulnerable? So there are quite some areas where they can actually be more vulnerable, because they don't always know how to navigate in these new media spaces. They also might trust their abilities a bit too much, so they are too certain, too confident in themselves to a certain account, that they know that they are critical, they know how to filter information. And finally, they don't have really this clear information selection criteria when it comes to online content. But with that, we show also that they have quite critical skills. They know how to cross-check, cross-media, and use multiple sources. So we can conclude that the focus might be a bit different, but they have same problems as the rest of the population. So they are not quite this, special group of people. So where can we go from here in terms of research? So of course, more comprehensive survey than we did. We just asked around 10 to 15 questions, and this was a part of a national survey, but special survey for digital literacy assessment skills would be a great addition to our research. Also, we want to try and continue with experiments for how to enhance learning, how to enhance knowledge in digital literacy skills. And finally, longitudinal observations might be really useful to understand also for how long the skills and knowledge are retained. So how long it takes to forget all that you have learned, and maybe how can you actually retain this information longer and use it for longer periods of time. So this was my presentation here. You can see also my email address. If you want to write to me personally, I would be really happy, but also address of my colleagues from the Ukrainian Media and Communication Institute, you can write to me and to them in Ukrainian if you understand perfectly well. And there is also a Facebook page of my colleagues and their website, so you can visit it and look what are they doing now, also in terms of media literacy, but also in other fields. Thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, looking forward to hearing from you.
What Ukraine can teach others on media literacy development. In my presentation, I'd like to highlight Ukrainian experience on how we deal with media literacy and what can we share with other countries of our experience. I believe that Ukrainian experience is quite unique, very important and very interesting due to the fact that Ukraine is under constant informational attacks by the Russian Federation, and we still quite successfully deals with these attacks with keeping unity and good consumption of the media content by Ukrainian population. In my presentation, I want to make 4 highlights on the 4 issues, and these 4 are having strategic approach and a strategy being in place in the area that we work. Second is having institutions built that can deal and maintain this strategy. The 4th is creativity, creative approach to having media literacy agenda and activities. And the 4th is important of coordination and cooperation. So with the first, with the strategic approach, Ukraine adopted the strategy on informational security in 2021, and part of the media literacy is part of this strategy on informational security, together with disinformation, developing of strategic communications, and also such more like peaceful areas as openness of the government, protecting rights of journalists. These strategic goals are also part of the strategy of informational security. In addition to the strategy, we have action plan, and the strategic goal of media literacy is divided in concrete activities, and different ministries, including our Ministry of Culture and Information Policy, but also Ministry of Education, Ministry of Defense, other ministries, they're in charge of execution of this strategy. Ministry of Culture and Information Policy is maintaining the general framework of working with the strategy of coordinating efforts of public and private institutions, and is overall in charge of the strategy and of its execution. So strategic approach and having written strategy is very, very much important, and I would say it's impossible to work without the strategic document and strategic approach. The second priority and the second important pillar is having institutions. We at the Ministry of Culture and Information Policy established in 2021, prior to the big invasion, 2 important institutions. One is the Center of Strategic Communication as an institution dealing with communication, with disinformation, with educational activities. And a second is special media literacy project called Filter that deals specifically with media literacy issues, and doing this job very successfully with different activities, with maintaining coordination role, with being visible and public, with also having component of sharing international experience, not only learning from other countries. I remember we started with Finland as country #1 in media literacy, but also sharing its experience with other nations. Third pillar of Ukrainian approach with media literacy is creativity. The National Media Literacy Project Filter is very creative in ways of communicating with auditors, in ways of persuading people, educating people, raising awareness. And current development of technologies is really providing for a lot of possibilities to be creative and to be successful in your activities. We do have a number of key initiatives within the media literacy, such as the national lesson of the unity with the media literacy, the national media literacy test. We work intensively with highlighting media literacy during the Media Literacy Week that is organized every year in Ukraine and actually globally. The global initiative is only effective when national authority, national educational institutions, national NGOs are taking this topic to work with that. We do have very successful project reporters for young students from schools who want to be in future journalists or work in the area of communication, who can participate, and if they win in this constant report, then they have unique opportunity to come to the capital of Ukraine, to speak with key journalists, to speak with key influencers and some state authorities who work in the area of the media literacy. The fourth pillar with the media literacy strategy in Ukraine is coordination. In Ukraine, we do have robust civil society that is very active in the topic of disinformation and media literacy. And actually, I believe that in early 2000 and prior 2020, the civil society initiatives were of the much bigger scale and importance than the initiatives of the state. So, key strategy for Ministry of Culture and Informational Policy with working with media literacy is coordinating efforts of all the stakeholders. That includes state authorities, NGOs, and international organizations. We do have coordination meetings. We share and combine our experience. We try to multiply effects and provide the possibility for the bigger scales with the state resources for private initiatives, for initiatives of the civil society. So having the strategic approach with the strategic documents on media literacy as the first key component. Having second component is institutional framework, having separate institutions and separate project that deals with media literacy. The third, our important strategy component is creativity. And the fourth that I'd like to highlight is coordination. So strategic approach, institutional framework, creativity, and coordination are our key strategies with successful work in media literacy area in Ukraine. Additionally, I want to highlight several more positions and arguments why media literacy is so much important specifically for Ukraine. Russia, with its disinformation attacks, with manipulation of the information, is trying to undermine the unity of Ukrainian people, of Ukrainian population. And media literacy, responsible consumption of the information, is very much important to keep the unity of Ukrainian people. And we see this as really one of the key objectives of the media literacy, is having and keeping this unity that is actually very strong since the beginning of the big invasion in February 2022. We see it by the sociology data, and we believe that media literacy efforts is also part of keeping and having this unity. The responsible consumption of the media information, of news, of other materials is one of the key components of having this unity. We do have challenges with different unregulated messengers and like the Telegram channels and other pretty popular nowadays means of providing information to the population, and we work with these challenges right now. For the final words, I want to highlight that Ukraine treats media literacy as a security issue, not just educational efforts. We do have media literacy as part of the information security strategy. We look at the media literacy and disinformation as part of the security agenda, and we believe it's far broader than just education, than just like literacy issue. It's very important, not just for Ukraine, but for every country in the world, to keep unity, to maintain security, to build good society, and to be a strong nation and successful country. Thank you very much.